Today, Tokina have announced their first ever zoom lens designed specifically for mirrorless cameras, and the kind people at Tokina Japan have sent me a pre-production copy of this lens to test out for myself. So what better lens to test this bad boy out against than its closest rival, the Tamron 11-20mm f2.8. Which is the best lens? Well, that's exactly what we're going to find out today. Although these lenses are identical in terms of weight, the new Tokina lens is around 1 centimeter shorter than its rival, though this smaller frame comes at a cost of having a marginally shorter zoom range of 11 to 18mm compared to the Tamron's 11 to 20mm. Both lenses are predominantly made from a composite plastic material, with neither option having any manual buttons or switches on the lens body. Though it's worth noting that the Tamron is the only one of these two to include dust and weather sealing around the lens mount. When shooting in manual focus mode, although the Tokina has a fairly short throw to it, it is very nice and responsive with absolutely no delay. The focusing on the Tamron, however, is painfully inconsistent, and the sensitivity appears to change depending on the speed at which you rotate the focus ring. Now, it's got to be said that the focus ring is nice and smooth, but the inconsistency just makes it incredibly frustrating to use. So if you do happen to rely on manual focus a lot when shooting, then this is probably the one to avoid. But manual focusing issues aside, both of these lenses are nicely made and feel very well put together, so I still think they both deserve a point for build and handling. In terms of price, again, there is very little separating these two choices, and although Tokina has provided a recommended retail price of $699, in reality we all know that once this lens goes on sale, it will most likely drop to below this price with most retailers. But even so, with just $50 separating these two lenses, it's too close to call an overall winner, so both deserve a point in this round for price. When it comes to autofocus, in good lighting conditions, both lenses are rapid to focus with no signs of hunting. In low light conditions, again, both lenses put in a solid performance and neither of them showed any signs of hunting. When shooting wide open in high-speed continuous mode, almost all of the shots I took with these two lenses were sharp and in focus, so a pretty impressive performance across the board, and that means both of these lenses deserve a point in this round. Switching over to video mode, and when shooting wide open at f2.8, both lenses were able to track George as he walked towards the camera at a regular pace with absolutely no issues at all. When repeating the test, but this time at a faster pace, again, there were absolutely no issues with either lens. As for AF noise, both of these lenses are pretty quiet, albeit for a small amount of purring from the Tokina, and a slight clicking noise from the Tamron. Now, both lenses do suffer from a touch of focus breathing, but to be honest, it's certainly not the worst set of results I've ever seen. But in any case, it's points for both of these lenses for video AF. In our bokeh test, both lenses offer slightly cat's eye shaped orbs at the center that turn into teardrop shapes as they get closer to the corners of the frame, which really isn't ideal. Both sets of bokeh balls are quite textured too, and there's also some haloing present on both sets of results. If I was being super picky though, I would even go so far as to say that the balls produced by the Tokina lens have more flat edges to them, whilst the Tamron balls appear more spherical. And this is slightly surprising to me, considering that the Tokina boasts 9 aperture blades, whilst the Tamron only has 7. In terms of general bokeh quality though, the Tokina offers a slightly softer and less textured result than the Tamron, but honestly, you wouldn't be disappointed with the results produced by either of these lenses, and so I think that both of these lenses deserve a point for bokeh. In our lens flare test, the Tamron does a slightly better job of protecting against flaring than the Tokina, which displays more prominent artifacting. But in any case, if this type of thing really bothers you, then you can always use the included lens hood to protect against lens flare. The good news is though that both of these lenses produce very clean looking longitudinal chromatic aberration test results, and at the top they both display a subtle green tint above the area of sharp focus, and at the bottom of the chart the Tokina exhibits a very small amount of red fringing, whilst the Tamron has more of a yellowish tint to it. When shooting with these lenses out in the real world though, they were both an absolute joy to use. When mounted to my Sony a6600, they both felt incredibly well balanced, and I really didn't come across any handling issues issues whilst working with these lenses. When shooting wide open at f2.8, the results I came away with were super sharp, and I was absolutely spoilt for choice when it came to picking which shots I wanted to edit up in Lightroom afterwards. Now, although these images were all shot wide open at f2.8, it is worth mentioning that the Tokina has the smallest minimum aperture of f22, whilst the Tamron is only able to stop down to f16, which might be useful to know for astro or landscape photographers. Now, as we've already touched on in this video, the Tokina has a slightly shorter reach than the Tamron, extending all the way to 18mm instead of 20mm on the Tamron. So what kind of difference does this make? Well, honestly, it's not all that noticeable. I mean, don't get me wrong, every millimeter does make a difference.
That's what she said!
Particularly when shooting at wider focal lengths, but in this case, it's the difference between just cropping in very slightly. When shooting at f2.8 at the 11mm end of these zooms, both lenses do suffer from barrel distortion, though the good news is that at the center they are both incredibly sharp with good levels of contrast. At the corners, both lenses starting to soften slightly, with the Tokina results being slightly sharper than that of the Tamron. Both of these lenses are able to focus insanely close up when at the 11mm end of the zoom, and they continue to display even levels of sharpness even at f2.8. At the long end of the zoom, the Tokina has next to no distortion, whilst the Tamron does now have a touch of pincushion distortion. When we zoom in, again, both lenses are nice and sharp even at f2.8, though the Tamron is very marginally sharper than the Tokina this time. When shooting at the minimum focusing distance at the long end of the zoom, the Tamron now takes the lead and offers a sharper result than the Tokina. So with results that are just so close, where does this leave things when it comes to handing out points for image quality? Well, I think the Tamron has got to get the winning point here, as not only does it offer the better protection from lens flare, but also it has noticeably sharper results when shooting wide open at the long end of the zoom. However, the Tokina just did so well in this round, I think it would be slightly unjust of me not to award this lens with at least half a point for the image quality, because it really is a superb lens. This means after a very closely fought battle, the Tamron just clinches the win by half a point, and to be honest, it's arguably the lens I would go for out of these two options for the following reasons. First of all, it does offer some form of weather sealing. Not a huge amount, but it's better than nothing, especially when you're shooting outdoors. It also has a slightly longer zoom range. Now, although we've already discussed that this extra 2mm doesn't really make that much of a difference, the key thing to take home here is that at this longer end, it does offer better image quality, especially when shooting wide open. And let's face it, as a portrait photographer, I'm going to most benefit from the longer end of the zoom compared to the wider one. All of that said though, I really can't end this video without saying hats off to Tokina with this new lens, because for a first ever zoom lens for a mirrorless camera, this thing is an absolute beauty, and I am really hoping that this is just the start of something really good for Tokina.